Murders at Karlov Manor was a total flop. It's on Ravnica, but for some reason, there are no guilds or normal Ravnican themes. It really should have been on New Capenna. That plane already has an LA Noire detective kind of theme. And sales numbers seem to reflect that. Looking at the Amazon pre-order sales, we can see Murders was pretty low. And it just shows there wasn't much hype for this set. But even though this set is a flavor fail, marketing fail, total misuse of Ravnica, the actual cards were pretty well designed. There are a ton of amazing cards for Commander in this set, and since it did not sell well, the supply on these is going to be pretty low. So a lot of the rares and mythics that are good in Commander will probably be pretty expensive once the set is out of print, or at least more expensive than another standard legal rare or mythic. Which is why this month on Better Than a Booster, I will be suggesting 10 cards that cost less than a Murders at Karlov Manor booster pack, which are about $3.50 as of recording. So all of the budget cards I suggest here will cost less than $3.50, and they will all be from Murders at Karlov Manor. Before I get into the list, if you like my content, consider subscribing and checking out the Patreon. Thanks. Also, before I get into the list proper, I want to give some honorable mentions. When I tell people this set has amazing cards, people look at me like I'm crazy, but there really are so many Commander staples in here. So here are some of my favorites, but they're not part of the budget picks for this month, because they're more than $3.50. First off, Surveil Lands. They're 100% auto-includes in basically every Commander deck, especially if you are playing fetches. Playing a Surveil Land on turn 1 feels like cheating since you almost get a cantrip for free. I'm very confident that these will just go up and up in price until they get reprinted. Other than the lands, Archdruid's Charm is a crazy powerful card in any deck that can afford triple green. In my green heavy decks, it's basically replaced Cultivate at this point. It's just so flexible and so powerful. Lastly, War Leader's Call is such a sweet card. It's an anthem late game after your creatures are in play, or early game, it pings and anthems. It's just so good. Put it in all your Boros Go wide decks. Okay, on to the actual 10 budget picks for this month. Starting with Crime Novelist. 2 and a red for a 1/3 Goblin Bard. Whenever you sacrifice an artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on Crime Novelist and add red. So this goes in basically any artifact deck, especially treasure decks. It essentially doubles the mana from your treasures, which by itself would be powerful, but the fact that this little goblin also becomes a huge goblin late game, it just means that once you get some counters going and sacrifice a few treasures, you can start chunking in for damage. Currently, it's less than $2, and with the steady increase in treasure cards, it's only going to become more powerful. Pick one up if you got an artifact deck. Another artifact support card is Forensic Gadegeteer. 2 and a blue for a Vidalcan Artificer Detective. 2/3, whenever you cast an artifact spell, investigate. Activated abilities of artifacts you control cost 1 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the cost to less than 1 mana. So this is an easy combo with Basalt Monolith. It's just infinite mana, 2 cards right there. But you don't need to combo for this to be good. You can play this in your clue decks, reducing the cost to sack the clues, or any artifact deck that just wants random artifacts lying around. Plus, if your commander is an artifact creature like Memnarch, you can reduce the cost of those activated abilities. It's currently under $3 and actually pretty powerful. I've seen it in a few CDH decks here and there. If you are a Simic player who loves to ramp and play huge X spells, then Dopplegang is a $1 card you might be interested in. XXX blue-green for a sorcery that says for each of X target permanents, create X tokens that are copies of that permanent. So at 5 mana, you can copy one thing one time. But come on, this is a Simic card. We're gonna have more than 5 mana. So at 8, you get 2 copies of 2 things. And that by itself can be massive. Imagine hitting an Avenger Zendikar and a Panharmonicon. That's 2 more Panharmonicons and 2 more Avengers, which is crazy. And of course, if you can make X bigger, it becomes insane levels of value. I also love how flexible this card is. It hits any permanent in play. You can make a copy of your opponent's stuff if you want, or lands. Making multiple copies of Field of the Dead seems like a surefire way to overwhelm your opponent with zombies. Or maybe copying your opponent's Cabal coffers. If they already have an Urborg in play, you can make multiple coffers to get even more mana. The possibilities are endless with this card. It seems like a ton of fun. Snarling Gorehound is an incredibly efficient common. 1 black for a 1/1 dog with menace. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield, under your control, surveil 1. Importantly, this card triggers for each creature that enters. Since it doesn't say 1 or more, it just says whenever another. So if you play this and then cast something that makes multiple tokens, then you're going to get to surveil that many times. If you're playing any deck that makes smaller tokens, or wants little creatures, then this is going to get you a ton of value. Doubly so if you have graveyard synergies. And at 9 cents, it's worth getting. Stun counters are a mechanic we don't see that often, but in Murders at Karlov Manor, we got Lost in the Maze. Blue X for an enchantment with flash. When Lost in the Maze enters the battlefield, tap X target creatures. Put a stun counter on each of those creatures you don't control. Tapped creatures you control have hexproof. I absolutely love how flexible this card is. You can use it to tap down your opponent's things, put a stun counter on them, and swing in, or since it has flash, you can do it on your opponent's turn and stop them from attacking you. But importantly, it doesn't put stun counters on your creatures, so you could play this to tap your own creature to give it hexproof, and then fizzle some removal. And honestly, even if X is 0, you can give your tapped creatures hexproof. So if you attack with your Voltron commander and then go to remove it, this can be a flash way to give it hexproof. You can play this in any blue deck that wants to tap down your opponent's creatures, or has things that it swings with, which you'd want to protect. This card really feels like an instant, yet it still works as an enchantment and has a permanent effect. And it's 15 cents, so pick one up and try it out. Connecting the Dots is another bulk rare that is really efficient. Red and 1 for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control attacks, exile the top card of your library face down. Pay red and 1, discard your hand, sacrifice Connecting the Dots. Put all cards exiled with Connecting the Dots into their owner's hands. This enchantment is phenomenal in any aggressive red deck. You get to deploy all your threats and attack while pseudo drawing a card every time, and then after a board wipe, you just sack the Connecting the Dots and refill your hand. And although this card is too slow for 60 card formats, which is probably why it's only 11 cents, I like that in Commander you can play it, attack with 3 creatures, and immediately exile 3 cards, and just ditch your hand and draw 3 if you really need it. In a go wide deck like Valduk or Caesar Legion's Emperor, it's perfect. I also really need to shout out Chalk Outline, 3 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever one or more creature cards leaves your graveyard, create a 2/2 white and blue detective, then investigate. This card is crazy value. I've been putting it in my Thrasios Tormod deck, link to the list in the description, and it puts in work. All your normal recursive things like reassembling skeleton work wonders here, but I really love Outline with channel creatures, Oval Chase Daredevil, and Tortured Existence. This is one of my favorite engines in my deck. It lets you channel the creature, then use Tortured to swap the channel card with Oval Chase, which makes a 2/2 and a clue. The clue then puts Daredevil back into hand, allowing you to reuse the channel card and swap them again. It's a really cool engine, but you don't have to do that specifically. If you're in any graveyard deck, Outline puts in work. Making extra bodies to sack or block, and leaving behind a clue will help you draw cards to recover after a board wipe. It does so much for a 4 mana 5-cent card. Cases were a new card type introduced in this set, and I think Case of the Uneaten Feast is a great budget pickup. 1 white mana for an enchantment case. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. To solve the case, you need to gain 5 or more life this turn. Then once it's solved, you may sacrifice the case to give creatures in your graveyard. You may cast this card from your graveyard until end of turn. At 1 mana and 21 cents, it's both mana and cost efficient. At its baseline, this is a Soul Sister, but once you gain 5 life, which should be easy, it suddenly becomes a Soul Sister that is a mini Yogg's Will late game. I'm shocked I don't see the card more. Deadly Cover-Up might at first look like an overcosted board wipe, but I actually think it's a real budget alternative to something like Damnation. 3 and a black for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast, you may collect Evidence 6, which just means exile cards from your graveyard with total mana value 6 or greater. Destroy all creatures. If Evidence was collected, exile a card from an opponent's graveyard, then search their graveyard hand library for any number of cards with that name and exile them. That player shuffles, then draws a card for each card exiled from their hand this way. So it always destroys everything without conditions, whether or not you collect evidence. But sometimes you can exile an annoying recursive card. Let's say your opponent is looping a Spore Frog with something. Well, now you can cast your board wipe, collect evidence, and exile the frog. Also, very weirdly, this is one of the few surgical kind of effects that can hit basics. So if you do play it kind of early and you're up against a monocolor deck and you happen to get a basic in the bin, you could just take a ton of lands out of their deck and mana screw them, although that's not super common. I think at 53 cents, this is one of the best budget board wipes in mono black. The last card I want to talk about today is Kylox's Voltstrider. Blue-red 1 for a 4/4 vehicle. Collect evidence 6. It becomes a creature until end of turn. It has crew 2, and when it attacks, you may cast an instant or sorcery from among cards exiled with it. If that spell would be put into a graveyard, put it on the bottom of its owner's library instead. So this card has way more value than I think people realize, and I'm not just talking about the fact that it's 16 cents. That is pretty good value. So you can cast this card in, let's say you had a dig through time in your yard. Now you just exile the dig through time, you swing, you cast a dig for free. And that's great value. This card is really good with delve spells, and it can work in your Spellslinger decks. You can exile a bunch of cantrips and then cast a cantrip when it attacks. But I actually don't think that's the best way to play this in Commander. The problem with the funny car is that it's just a 4/4 and will probably die in combat after casting one spell. But the upside is that this is a reanimation card for instants and sorceries. It's not for Spellslinger decks, but instead big mana spell copy decks. Let's say you cast a Time Stretch, then attack with this. Boom, take 4 turns. How about double Amanatu's Augury? Or maybe 2 Magma Opuses? Opusi? What's the plural of opus? Regardless, Magma Opus is awesome since it can pitch itself to make a treasure. Or how about adding other synergy? Use Entomb to put a Worst Fears in the bin and then steal someone's turn? I think this card is very silly and can be powerful in the right shell. I think it's a weird spell copy effect that can sometimes survive and copy another spell. It doesn't die to most board wipes at sorcery speed, so it's not unreasonable to board wipe and then use this and have it survive. So those were my 10 budget picks from Murders at Karlov Manor that I think you should pick up before the prices go up. What do you think? Do you like these picks? What do you think of Murders at Karlov Manor in general? Do you agree it's a bit of a sleeper? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so very much for watching, and special thanks to my tier 3 patrons, whose names you see here. If you want to be in the credits or check out any of the other perks, link to the Patreon is in the description.